Hey everyone, welcome to session 8.2. Let's take a look first at pages 482 and 483. And here you could see how we have VLOOKUP and HLOOKUP on the side. So VLOOKUP, as you know, looks for an index, which could be a number or a word or something, and then it looks across the same row, and we pick how many columns. HLOOKUP basically works the exact same way, but it works up and down instead of side to side. Okay, so we're building off of the table example that we had before, and we're going to build a lookup table. We're also going to talk about the if-error function, and it lets us have a lot of control over if there's a problem, and if so, if there's an error, and if so, it's going to let us create a custom error message. In the meantime, let's take a look at this example for the soccer game. And this is the example from figure 816 on page 484. So basically, we have to test, is 21 bigger than 18? And if so, it's going to be a win, loss, or tie for the home team. So how do we do this? If we use one if statement, we could just type in equals if. And the first thing is going to be our logical test. Is 21 larger than 18? Now, if it's true, we're going to write 1. And if it's false, we're going to write lost. Okay, so basically, if we apply this to all the scores, if the first cell is larger than the second cell, we're going to either have a win or a loss. But the problem is that we want to also have another category called tie, because you'll note that game 3 isn't actually a loss, it's 9 against 9. It should say tie here. Okay, so we could do that by having multiple layers of our if statement. Now you remember from module 8 video, 8.1, we talked about nested if statements. So for example, if we're checking grades, above a certain number, give it an A, or give it a B, or give it a C, or give it a D. So we're going to design those tests to see what happens. So let's start with our formula again. And we're going to start by if C1 is bigger than D21, then say it won. Because if this number is bigger than that number, then it's going to be a win for the home team. Otherwise, instead of saying loss, let's put in 2 new categories. Okay, so we're going to put in a bracket, and we're going to put in a new if statement with a new bracket. Our new logical test is going to be if our D21 is greater than C21, then for the home team, that would be a loss. Otherwise, it would be a tie. Okay, so let's take a look at what we have here. We're saying if the home game is bigger than the away game, then it's 1. But if that's not true, so if it's not that one is bigger than the other, then let's take a look at the next if statement. The next layer is it says if D21 is bigger than C21, right? So we could do this in multiple ways, but this is one option. If that's true, then put in loss. Otherwise, if that's not true, then put in tie. The only way that this rule can't be true and this rule can't be true is if the numbers are the same. Okay, so I hit enter. Let's drag this formula down. And now we have win, loss, tie, right? Which is nesting one formula inside another, giving us multiple layers. Now, sometimes with an if statement, because there's so many pieces to it, it is possible to get them confused and they won't work anymore, right? Because you'll notice that in here we have a second if statement, but inside this second if statement, we could put a third if statement and so on, right? We could branch out in multiple ways, and it's important when we're building these to make sure that they're clear enough that we're actually able to figure out what's going on. There are other techniques to do this kind of calculation, this branching logic, and it's important to keep in mind that if we're running into problems, we have to really carefully trace back each step to make sure they make sense. So let's look at the grades again. Okay, so we start off with our grade, and then it's basically true or false. If it's true, we could assign it an A, or we could have it do another true or false based on if it's an A, right? If it's not, then we'll take the number again and we'll test it against our criteria, and then we'll get another true and false. And we'll just keep on going on like this, right? Now, inside these, which is normally the answer, we could also have branching logic as well. So you can see just by having a few layers, it already gets really complicated, and we have a huge number of brackets inside our formula, which is sometimes required, but usually you could adopt a different strategy in order to ensure that the formula is cleaner and simpler than going through all these different layers. You could look at the example on page 485, which has 3 nested if statements, one after another, and you could look at the flow chart of what that looks like on figure 818 on page 486, where basically we start at the top and it says, is years of service greater than 10? If it's true, then they get a bonus of 500. Otherwise, is years of service greater than 5 or equals to 5? If it's true, it's 250. Otherwise, if it's basically anything from 1 to 4, then it's bonus 100. And we could see how we have the nested if statements inside the formula on page 486. Okay, I recommend reading the green box on page 486 to understand if there is a problem. Okay, so you can see an example of how this works with the table we were just using on page 487 and 488. Next, we're going to go ahead to lookup functions on page 489. And you'll remember this table, we expanded a little bit, but basically this is the table that we used for VLOOKUP back in Module 3. Okay, so if you look at figure 821 on page 490, the idea is that we look up the value here, and then we decide what column we want to pull the answer from. Right, so the first thing that we do is we have our lookup box, or we called it Lookaroo in class, either way. Okay, so this is what it's going to match to, so whatever's in here should match to this. And then we have to decide what information we want to bring back. So for our case, I'm just going to type in name, and if the order was over 10K. Okay, which is like an arbitrary number that we decided that we wanted to bring back. So what we're going to do is we're going to write equals v lookup, and it's going to tell us that we need 3 parts. The first thing is the lookup value, so we're going to pick the lookup box. The next thing is we need a table array, so we're going to look anywhere inside of here. And the last thing is which column is going to bring back, and customer name is column number 2, 1, 2. So we'll type it at 2 and hit enter. Right now it's going to say NA because there's nothing in the lookup box. Like we talked about before, if we put this inside of an if statement, we could make it not show up if there's an error. Okay, over 10K, we'll do the exact same thing. We'll go equals v lookup. Our lookup value is going to be our lookup box. Table array will be all these. Index number is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so let's take a look if it works. So Peter Parker did spend over 10,000. Let's try number 4, and it says no. Okay, now similar to what we talked about in the soybean example, at the end of the VLOOKUP, we could add a true or false, and that's going to give us an exact match or not. And you could read more about that on page 492 and 493. Next, we're going to take a look at HLOOKUP, which you could see on page 496 and 497 and onwards. If you look at the graph 8.30 on page 498. It'll basically show you what we're doing, and let's take a look at a really quick example. So VLOOKUP, we have a table of numbers. So we have, let's say, like 1, blue, and 4. And we tell VLOOKUP, match the 1, then count the number of columns over to get to the 4. Right? So that's what we've been doing up until now with VLOOKUP. HLOOKUP works the exact same way, except instead of going side to side, it actually goes up and down. So let's take a look at this formula that I put in. I wrote equals HLOOKUP, and I said color. So color is what we're matching to. A1 to A5. And then I picked number 4, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, and it comes back and tells us pink. Okay, so we could have this as a cell reference instead of as a word, or we could have it as the result of a formula to carry out the HLOOKUP. Okay, so there's a lot of different options. Let me just put A1 in there. Okay, and we'll get pink. So that's how HLOOKUP works, and we could also put HLOOKUP in an if statement to make sure that it doesn't return an argument if A1 is blank, just like we had with VLOOKUP. So basically it works the exact same way, except it works up and down instead of side to side. It's important that the first cell of your range, just like we had with VLOOKUP, is the top of whatever you specify. It doesn't have to be the top of the page. It could be in the middle, but it's still, we're looking for the first value at the top and then going down from there. Okay, now next we're going to look at a very simple version of what to do with the custom error message. So let's take a look what I said. I said if error, and this is going to happen if there's a problem. Instead of saying NA, which is normally what would happen, we could have a custom message show up in the cell which says waiting. So I say if error, and inside of that I nest HLOOKUP with our same criteria. Now because HLOOKUP is currently blank, so I could type in color, and then it would change to pink. But if there was nothing in here, then it would change to waiting. Okay, and this is a way that we could set up a custom message instead of it just saying what it normally would be something like this, hashtag n/a. That's normally what would happen if there is no message. But we can customize this to say whatever we want. And if error is very simple. It only has 2 parts. So the first one is if error. Okay, then we have our value, which is basically our formula. And we could put it in HLOOKUP, VLOOKUP, or anything else. And then we put a comma, and the second part is if there's an error, what value do you want to put in? What do you want to display? Okay, so let's say if error is nothing, then the value is test. Okay, nothing shows up because there's no error that's generated. In this case, it says waiting because normally it would say NA because this formula would result in nothing, right? Because this cell A1 is blank. Okay, so if I put that in, it changes to pink. All right, so that's a good example of how it works. You could read about this on page 501, and you could use if error multiple times. You could nest it to return a word or a phrase for each time that you have an error in your formula. I would also go through the session 8.2 quick check on page 505 just to make sure that you got all of the concepts from this session. Next, we're going to continue on with 8.3 conditional formatting and functions.